They reason that because vaccination is generally good and desirable, everybody should do it. And because it provides some sort of a transient benefit, you should do it. It's generally desirable. It's good for public health policies. And we're going to use means available to us to encourage and incentivize that behavior.
Well, there's a difference between should and must, let's say, not least. And then, of course, we have the problem Rupa pointed out, which was the scientific evidence for the utility of the travel ban itself was apparently entirely lacking. So at the moment, and I don't know how this is playing out in court, but in the context of this conversation and other conversations I've had that are similar, the evidence, legal and scientific on the government, and let's also say moral, shall we, on the government side seems pretty, well, how about we call it appallingly and unprecedentedly weak?
Well, it's interesting that you use the word morality there, because I actually, in cross-examinations, I did ask the individual who was responsible for the development of the policy whether there was an ethical consideration behind the vaccine mandate. And the answer is that there is not, which is astounding because there's actually an ethical frame. No, it gets better. There's actually an ethical framework available by the government online that is supposedly used to guide ethical decision-making in the context of the pandemic. So
that wasn't used either?
No.
So if we tried to give the devil his due, and so I'll speak as a critic of Rupa here, her claim fundamentally is that this was nothing but blatant, cynical, narcissistic politicking of the lowest order. And we might say, well, no, that's probably an oversimplification. There must have been some other justification generated, like in good faith, and then also post hoc, as at least as a cover-up. But essentially, in some sense, what you seem to be saying is that you've uncovered very little evidence of any of that in the cross-examinations. So even as a scam, it wasn't a very good one.
There is evidence that, vaccines can help protect against developing severe outcomes and death. The question is, how compelling is that evidence? How long does that protection actually last? But the bigger question is, why does that matter in the context of the transportation system? When you're talking about the fact that travel contributes 1% or less by the government's own data to COVID-19 transmission, and somehow this is the targeted industry that we're going to focus on and impose a vaccination requirement as a precondition for travel, why isn't anyone comparing that to the general epidemiological situation in the community? And here's a surprise for you, nobody did that. Nobody looked to compare what's the positivity like in different settings in the general community. Because if you're not traveling, where are you? You're at home, you're in the supermarket, you're watching soccer, you're watching a basketball game, all of which, by the way, you can do without being vaccinated, but you can't travel, which is also one of the safest places to be. I mean, we have an expert, who has testified that and this is public knowledge. I mean, the filtration system in modern aircrafts are better than the filtration systems in operating rooms.
Okay, so you just dropped two bombshells there, eh? Not that there haven't been any others dropped during this conversation, but two. I'm going to highlight them. The first is that by the government's own admission, travel was a vector for the transmission of less than 1% of the virus. So now we're talking at best about a 1% probability of contracting a disease that has something approximating a 2% mortality rate, if that. And that's particularly true only for people who are extremely ill or extremely elderly, who have other compromising health conditions. So it's a negligible risk of a negligible risk, but that justifies charter right suspension. And then you said something equally appalling, which was that anyone with any sense would have rank ordered transmission risks, right, across all the possible, let's say across the range of 95% of the social interactions and activities that Canadians engage in. We would have rank ordered that in terms of danger. One of the things we would have found out, by the way, is that locking people up together was probably a dangerous thing to do rather than a good thing to do. But in any case, that's what you do at the policy level, right? Here's the dangers, rank ordered. Let's knock them off from the top down. But you said none of that happened either. There was no methodology for doing a comparative analysis. And that's reminiscent to me of the fact that we locked down everybody at home and we blew apart the supply chain. We never did any analysis whatsoever to find out if the economic consequences of that were going to be more devastating physically, psychologically, and in the long term than the epidemic itself. And they're going to end up being far more devastating than the epidemic, I think, by all evidence generated to date. So Bruce, maybe we'll turn over to you for a bit to get a bit of an overview, and then I'm going to go back to talk about the funding situation. Then we'll go back to Rupa. Bruce, two questions come to mind for me right away. The first is, if the government, let's say it more clearly, if the mandarins in the Trudeau cabinet violated the charter for the purposes of their instrumental politicking, how serious is that offense in legal terms, and what is the recourse?
Right, well, let's back up just a step. Before you get to the charter even, there's a principle in governance, which is this. Governments can't just create any policies that they like. There's a difference between the government and the legislature. And anything a government does in terms of making rules, it has to have authorization to do in a statute that the legislature has passed. And in this case, in the case of the airline mandate, we're talking about the Aeronautics Act. Now, the Aeronautics Act gives to Cabinet and the Minister of Transportation the power to make all kinds of rules about all kinds of things that deal with flight, with the airline industry. But that's not an open-ended discretion. The fact of the matter is that governments make policies that are politically motivated all the time. And they're allowed to do that as long as they can fit them within the authority that they have in a statute. But the problem for the government in this respect is this, that the rationale that they've given, if they've given one at all, does not fit within the authority that the Aeronautic Act gives. So in other words, the minister is allowed to create interim orders that have to do with the safety of the airline industry, of the passengers, of the crew, and so on. And the premise of a vaccine mandate is that if you have the vaccine, then you won't get infected. And if you don't have the vaccine, then you will get infected. But in the case of this vaccine, that has really never been the case. It was pretended to be early on, but that has never been really the official claim, at least from the manufacturers of this vaccine. So